Hello, everybody. If you're tuning in, we're going to discuss what a strange and bonkers poem Beowulf is. If you've not read it before, it's very odd in terms of its narrative and its cultural background. That's why I created our previous bonus homework assignment. If you remember, it asked you to name the good things in life. Many of you, I assumed you said things like having good friends, families, happy memories, a decent job, maybe even a house and a car, a couple of kids. After all, let's be honest. Why do most people go to college? It's mostly to get these kinds of things. I also asked you to think about what every fairy tale you've ever heard contains. In those fairy tales, what makes a good king? Most of you, I bet, you answered that good kings are wise, just, and usually kind. Evil kings, on the other hand, have the opposite qualities. So what you're going to find in the very first stanza of Beowulf, though, is that good kings are not wise, just, or kind. Those are not virtues particularly desired in the good kings you're going to find in the Dark Ages of Northern Europe. Good kings are, however, supposed to be bloodthirsty. Shield Sheepsit is the scourge of many tribes, a wrecker of meat benches. He demands tribute from vanquished foes, and he acquires many thralls, which are kind of like slaves. That is one good king, says the poem in line 11. So, Beowulf is a poem whose world is filled with fire and slaughter, and that doesn't cause anyone to even bat an eye. There's no paeans to justice here. Nobody cares about wisdom or charity or even mercy. Nobody in the world of Beowulf wants to go to college or find themselves a decent middle-class lifestyle. Instead, the world of Beowulf is set in an ancient heroic society of the Dark Ages. Honor and glory in war are all they care about. Shield Sheepsit is the strongest warrior and a great giver of booty and gifts to his thanes, and that is why his name is honored in the poem. This helps explain why the world of Beowulf might seem strange to us. In fact, it's not really talking about us at all. It's talking about an attitude toward the world that's 1,000 years old. It's an attitude to life completely alien to modern ways of thinking. Just think about what you do if some criminal committed some horrible crime against you. What would you do? You might go to the police, you might sue, maybe you even pray. Or if you're particularly pious, you might turn the other cheek. None of that applies in Beowulf. There, if somebody does you wrong, you first demand a payment of money. If you don't get it, then you try to kill the person who wronged you. And then maybe you try to kill his entire family, too. Just an example, in line 1384, when Hrothgar is maddened with grief after Grendel's mother murders his friend Aesir, this is what Beowulf tells Hrothgar. He says, don't seek a trained psychologist. He doesn't tell him to seek out a grief counselor, but seek revenge. In the Anglo-Saxon world, revenge is grief's only cure. And you have to admit, from our perspective, that's a strange attitude to have, if you're serious about it. Of course, you see that in movies. We see revenge plot lines all the time. But deep down, we also know that personal vendettas are entirely forbidden by our society. If somebody kills your brother, or your cousin, or your best friend, you know deep down, really, that personal revenge is not a real option. When you're reading Beowulf, though, it is. And not only is personal revenge an option, it's almost an expectation. But Beowulf is also strange in terms of its basic narrative. So strange, in fact, that I've been actively requiring you guys to read plot summaries. Like I said, there are 3 major episodes to the poem. You have Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon. But there's no coherent plot line to the poem. No clear beginning, middle, or end. It has these long digressions that involve familial blood feuds that have nothing to do with the main monsters of the story. Sometimes it even repeats the same digression multiple times. And that's what happens when Beowulf is talking about the murder of his uncle Haysten by the Swedes. And the Swedes, by the way, are very bloodthirsty in this poem. But Beowulf first tells the story of his uncle's death in line 2482, and then he repeats the same story with slightly different wording about 400 lines later. So, if this was a creative writing class, the Beowulf poet would not do well. The professor would be like, Hey, Beowulf poet, you're wasting the reader's time with these repetitions. Get on with the story. But Beowulf, you've got to remember, was composed for people who were mostly illiterate. Anglo-Saxon society was an oral culture, and that carries a lot of different narrative expectations and conventions than we consider acceptable for modern print culture. There's other narrative oddities in the poem too. In addition to digressions, blood feuds, and repeated stories, it loves listing family genealogies for extended lengths of time. Hell, if you started getting confused in your reading about who was whose son and whose uncle was whose nephew, you're not alone. It took medieval scholars decades to sort all that stuff out. For our class, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to know these ins and outs of family trees. For our purposes, for us, we'll be considering solely the monsters. But the Strangeness of Beowulf as a poem is why I'm trying to ease you guys into it. That's why I started this course off with Mork and the Hook. Even if you've not seen or heard those stories before, you're still relatively familiar with those cultural backgrounds behind them. The 1950s and the 1980s, we kind of know about them already, even if you grew up, at least if you grew up in the United States, you kind of know them already. You know about cars, you know about the Cold War, you know about dating. So, in that sense, neither Mork nor the Hook make that many cultural assumptions that you don't already have in your possession. That's not the case with Beowulf, which was written over 1,000 years ago. This poem expects very different things from its audience. Like I said, it's not about us. When Shield Sheafson goes rampaging among his enemies, does he have to worry about committing war crimes or violating the Geneva Conventions? No. It's considered bad manners to kill the innocent and helpless. There's no glory in it, but it's not necessarily evil like we consider it now. Likewise, women. As you might have noticed, Beowulf is a pretty guy-centric poem, and the men it mentions are almost all warriors. They kill monsters, they kill people, and that's what they do for a good time. What do you do if you're a woman? Well, first off, we don't know very much about them. There's not many women mentioned in the poem. Maybe if you're a queen, you get a mention by name. That is to say, if you're a woman and you occupy society's highest rank, maybe you get a shout out. But even then, the queens, they're not what we would consider strong, independent figures. For Hrothgar's queen Beowulf, she serves her husband food and drink. She's basically a glorified waitress with a lot of rings and nice dresses. On the flip side, in a heroic society, women are also supposed to be grievers, as well as cupbearers. In a society where most of the men spend their time fighting battles, guess what? A lot of them die. The women, though, they live on, and their job is to mourn. The woman Hildebert is a case in point. Her husband, her brother, her uncles, they all die in a blood feud, and she's left to grieve fiercely and deeply for them. But you don't find women on the other end in the honorable and prestigious roles reserved for men, except for Grendel's mother. But she's got her own thing going on, and we'll discuss that later. Finally, I also mentioned the idea that there are blood feuds in Beowulf, and this was their basic system of justice. If you guys know much about American history and have heard of the Hatfields and the McCoys, that's the most famous family feud in American history, you kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about here with blood feuds. But you have to remember, there are no lawyers in the world of Beowulf. There's no law courts. If somebody harms another person, steals something, or causing them bodily injury, they have to pay what's called weirgild, or a blood price in money. Otherwise, the only alternative is vengeance and slaughter. So, from a 21st century perspective, there are a lot of things that are strange about Beowulf. And that's the key thing to think about as you go through this poem. All those good things in life that we talked about, the house, the car, the 2.2 kids, they don't matter in the slightest to people in Beowulf's world. All that matters are honor and glory. Nobody dies in bed. And what's more, nobody even really wants to. They don't think that's a good thing necessarily. Real warriors are supposed to die in battle, and warriors want their famous deeds to live on forever in the songs of poets for centuries to come. That's what matters. the immortality of fame. And that is why reading a poem like Beowulf can be so fascinating. Think about it. Say that something like human nature exists, and it persists the same throughout history. We're all human, right? And so, in some sense, we all share the same kind of human nature. So, what is it about Beowulf, this bloody and unhappy poem about doom, that speaks to modern people living in modern society? The Danes and the Geats don't want the same things out of life that we do, but maybe there's something about human nature that flourishes in the world of Beowulf, that bloody world, something that has no outlet in modern society, something that modernity represses rigidly. Probably, maybe that's a good thing, right? Blood feuds are still kind of a thing, actually. You see them a lot of times in mafia movies. The Godfather trilogy is a good example. You also see blood feuds kind of in gang violence. And nobody laments not having that stuff around anymore. But the quest for fame and honor, those are still things, kind of. And so I want to leave you guys with an open question. What is it about human nature, which is supposed to be always forever the same, that makes a poem like Beowulf and its alien cultural world something relevant to us still?